I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake,
I'm Rosie.
and this is our Close But No Cigar, or perhaps Close But No podcast, where we're just going to run through a few things that we almost did a podcast about, but didn't quite want to. In some cases, we got very close to recording a podcast about these things, and then decided, no, let's not do a podcast about that. Let's do it about something else we'd rather do a podcast about. These are presented in no particular order, or perhaps more accurately, the order that I happen to read them off this old Christmas card that I'm currently holding. And we're not going to include any details about what they are or when they're from. If you're listening to us mentioning them and you want to know what they are and you don't already know, you'll have to go and find out for yourself. Some Like It Hot is a movie we both enjoy very much. Clearly we didn't think it was going to translate into a full podcast, but unlike some of the things on here, that doesn't mean we don't like it very much, because we do. We watch it regularly and enjoy it and laugh at it.
An entire podcast on it might get very involved because, like everything really, it's good in its time. There are some rather dated attitudes. There's a tragic story of Marilyn Monroe to go with it. But all those things, I think, generally we prefer to forget and just enjoy the humour and the excellent performances of Marilyn, Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and the supporting cast.
Interceptor is something that I used to find the end of when I was recording Nightmare off Challenge TV in the noughties, and eventually I started watching on Challenge because I thought it looked interesting, and we both got kind of interested in it, and we watch it occasionally on YouTube and find it a lot of fun, with Annabelle Croft and her really wonderful, excited presenting style, and Sean O'Kane as the Interceptor. And what do you say about why his performance is so good?
Annabelle's presenting style is beautifully complemented by Sean O'Kane's total immersion in his antagonistic role as the Interceptor.
He's obviously having a great deal of fun playing the baddie and using his special physical skills that he's developed over the years.
He really seems to want to stop the contestants from winning the money, even though all that's going to happen is that it's going to stay inside the backpack instead of get unlocked.
And one of the things that obviously wasn't planned to be a huge part of the series, or a part of the series at all, that developed so wonderfully because of chemistry between the people working on it, was the Interceptor's relationship with his helicopter pilot Mikey, which is one of those things that if they brought it back for a second series would probably have been overdone, forced. But as it is, it's really rather wonderful. Probably the funniest bit is Mikey saying, "You're gonna double my miserable salary and make it pathetic." Michael Palin and his globe-trotting adventures I was considering choosing instead of Poirot. Poirot had already been bumped in the podcast schedule by the Living Dead trilogy, but I did go with Poirot in the end, and it's ended up being the only podcast that went over 35 minutes since Upstairs Downstairs, so it was obviously worth doing. But Michael Palin was something we've been getting back into quite recently. His globe-trotting adventures, particularly his early ones, with a specific set route around the world in 80 days, pole to pole and full circle, are extremely entertaining to watch. I mean, he's wonderful the way he interacts with people all round the world. There's some truly fascinating pieces of travel on there. It's a very enjoyable thing to watch, Michael Palin's travels, but not a full podcast's worth, I decided in the end.
He's got all the essential ingredients to do that. Physical fitness, genuine fascination with the things that he's learning and the people he's talking to, the ability to get on with these people, and a sense of humour, which you really need because you're very likely to get into some situations that a different temperament would find frustrating. And I don't think there's anyone else, even though he was third choice, I think, to present Around the World in 80 Days, who's got those ingredients in the right measure.
As you mentioned third choice, I'm going to stop following my logical route around my Christmas card and skip to Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, because I think it turned out on that interesting documentary that was made only last year, as we record this podcast, by which I mean it was made in 2023, where Michael Crawford admitted or let us into the interesting fact that he was the third choice to play Frank Spencer. And that's one of those things where you hear that and you think, well, really, I don't think either of the first two choices he mentions there would have been any good at all. I think that's true in the case of Michael Palin and in the case of Michael Crawford as Frank Spencer. Some Others Do Have 'Em is something that I used to enjoy very much watching with supper when I was quite young. And you remember it being on as well at that sort of time, don't you?
Yes, I do. I was very confused actually because the first one I was really taking any notice of was the flashback episode. So I thought that when the show started, he and Betty were only just meeting each other and then they were married later on.
But I did absolutely used to love his stunts when I was 5 or 6 or something like that. I wanted to see Frank Spencer, that silly man. Michael Crawford said children liked him because he was that silly man. He's absolutely right. Breaking things and crashing into things and having chicken houses fall around his ears and things like that. Absolutely brilliant stuff, very accessible for a child. Of course, as we've discovered quite recently, we don't really like a lot of the plot and other comedy that complements that. We've watched it all through on BBC iPlayer very recently, and we're quite disappointed with it overall, I think it's fair to say. We've had this VHS tape for many years, decades, which is called The Best of Some Mothers Do Have 'Em and contains 3 episodes from Series 2 and 2 episodes from Series 3. And we've now been driven to the inescapable conclusion that it really is the best of Some Mothers Do Have 'Em. We've always thought the 2 Series 3 episodes weren't nearly as good as the Series 2 episodes, but they are by far the best Series 3 episodes that they did put on the tape. It's been quite carefully chosen and very well chosen. So I think that's where our future relationship with Some Mothers Do Have 'Em lies, on that videotape. Groundhog Day is a very funny movie, and it does showcase Bill Murray's skills very well and use them in a very entertaining way, like Ghostbusters does. Thanks to his efforts there, along with Harold Ramis directing, they've created a very funny and successful movie that does the time loop concept very well in a time when nobody was really familiar with the time loop concept in media. So it's a film we do have on DVD and enjoy watching occasionally.
I've noticed that it has the exact same structure as both What Women Want and Bruce Almighty, which are both also films about a famous actor ending up with some kind of power ability. But of course, Groundhog Day predates both of those, and we know from the bonus features on the DVD that Harold Ramis was extremely active in sorting out the script and structuring it properly, so all plaudits to him for that.
Third Rock from the Sun is something that I found randomly on BBC Two at 6:30 one time, and I used to dip in and out of and enjoy, and eventually we both ended up watching the final 3 seasons, I think, together, and laughing sometimes. We had it on DVD, German DVD, at one point, but we don't have it now. Some bits of it are very funny, some bits of it are very pathetic. It's a very mixed bag, but it has caused us enjoyment and entertainment at some points in the past, which is why we were considering podcasting about it. But in the end, we decided not to.
It's got a marvellous cast. You get the most out of it that anybody could. I did mention it on our Flintstones podcast when I was saying that Kristen Johnston was channeling Sally Solomon in her portrayal of Wilma, being a fish out of water. It's that kind of comedy. And some season 4 and 5 episodes in particular, which are 2 of the last 3 seasons, I found terribly funny the first few times. But yes, overall it's not really something that either of us felt we wanted to watch anymore.
Heartbeat is something that we watched. Rosie stopped long before I did. on Sunday nights for a very long time, and I have mentioned it at least a couple of times on these podcasts. And it's one of these things like a soap, and when these dramas go practically 52 weeks a year, far too many weeks a year, like Heartbeat did, they kind of turn into soaps, and you get far too much death and drama and unbelievably silly things going on in a very limited area. It always made me laugh how on teletext the blurb would always say, "in the sleepy Yorkshire village of Aidensfield." And I used to say, look, teletext, the last thing Aidensfield is sleepy. It's an absolute hotbed of crime. They didn't even that often use the main big town Ashfordley for crimes to be committed in either. It usually was in Aidensfield, and it really did get extremely ridiculous.
The whole appeal of Heartbeat, of course, is that it's a lovely countryside village which is forever living in the 1960s. And there's a certain kind of aspirational aspect to it because the lead character, whichever one it may be, Nick Berry or one of his successors, has come from London or perhaps another large city latterly to live nice and quietly. Although, as the actors will often joke in the documentaries they make about it, Aidensfield has more crime than the whole of London.
They did manage to sneak that into the show at least once, where Sergeant Miller, who was around for quite a long time towards the end, was told by someone, "I'm surprised you're satisfied being in charge of a small police station like this. You can't get much crime going on around here." And he raises his eyebrows and says, "You'd be surprised." You reminded me there, actually, of what you were saying about Bergerac to me quite recently. I was watching some repeats of Bergerac on UK Gold, and as I mentioned on the Poirot podcast, it's something I associate with staying up late, and perhaps as I didn't mention on the Poirot podcast, eating cheesy wotsits. And we were discussing how the plots in Bergerac are complete nonsense. And you were saying that thing about the aspirational setting, the lovely Jersey and the classic car, and that's what people want to see and what makes the show successful. And yes, I think you're definitely right. The same is true of the Yorkshire Moors and Aidensfield. They had a great tourist trade going on at the real village that was Aidensfield in the filming. Like when Last of the Summer Wine ended, there was another Yorkshire village that lost all its tourist trade and was extremely upset about it. But always in these cases, some mainstay actors stick around and help to make it interesting and fun and feel very familiar and think, oh yes, Sunday night, time for that. In the case of Bergerac, I remember always enjoying, even when I was little, Terence Alexander as Charlie Hungerford, and I still do now. But I'll always remember fondly the performances of Derek Folds as originally Sergeant, then retired Oscar Blaketon, and William Simons as originally Police Constable, and then Civilian Administrator Alf Ventress. On Heartbeat, they turned out to be the two big mainstays. And mustn't Mark Jordan as PC Phil Bellamy have been kicking himself? He finally decided to leave after 15 years, and then 2 years later they cancelled the whole show. I bet he thought, oh, well, I might as well have stuck around. But as you mentioned there, yes, it was originally a vehicle for Nick Berry and his music, which didn't take off in a big way. And Nick Berry's voice was always heard on every episode right up until the end, singing the theme tune. And in many ways it did seem kind of redundant when he left, replacing him with other Aidensfield village bobbies on a motorbike. But they squeezed a lot of entertainment and ratings out of it for 18 years, so it's definitely earned its mention on this podcast. The Mask is a movie that broke a lot of ground in 1994 with its computer graphics. It's by far the best movie that Jim Carrey gets to make, the best material he's given, and he showcases his skills, both his wacky skills and his kind of everyday person in a strange situation skills, extremely well in it. I first watched the movie at a sleepover when I was 12, and I and the other 3 boys there derived a great deal of enjoyment from it for various reasons. But I've always come back to it since and very much enjoyed the comedy and the wacky action and some of the more interesting points about the metaphorical masks we wear and repression and how people treat each other. So it's something that's in our DVD collection and we do still regularly enjoy.
When I first saw it, I was already very familiar with the cartoon series, and I was a bit disappointed that it wasn't more like the cartoon. But I've enjoyed it more after a gap of quite a few years when suddenly the VHS reappeared. And it was a lot better than I remembered, where I was trying to watch the cartoon on YouTube. I was thinking, oh, it's not that great.
When we were randomly starting to talk about the cartoon once, as we occasionally randomly talk about things sometimes for no particular reason, you described it to me as amusing fun. And I said, yes, that's exactly what it was. Nothing too much to worry about. No rules to stick to, worrying about things from the movie like it only works at night. But it was amusing fun, and Rob Paulsen was good in the role of Stanley and the Mask, doing things like covering the missile in bread and ranch dressing and salad and stuff, and then saying, that's right, I'm gonna eat it. So we did used to enjoy watching it in the mid-90s, but yeah, it hasn't really translated into adulthood, unlike many cartoons and other children's shows.
The film is one of those things where the protagonist has two love interests, and you're thinking, well, how is he or she supposed to possibly pick? There's nothing wrong with either of them. And then you think, oh, that's how, when one of them turns out to be evil, which I think is proof that that in itself doesn't have much to do with whether you're enjoying a movie by the time you get up to that point. And Frozen or Starter for 10, either the movie is speaking to you or it isn't, and in the case of the Mask, it very much is.
We came dangerously close to doing a podcast about the Ink Thief. I've even edited out from previous podcasts promises that we will do a podcast about the Ink Thief. I had the VHS tape that we recorded off CITV many years ago ready in hand, and then I thought, well, instead of putting this in the video machine to watch it and make a podcast about, I think I'd rather throw it away, and you were quite happy to fall in with that plan, so I did throw it away. I'm sure we mentioned the Ink Thief as what Richard O'Brien did after the Crystal Maze. It should be a very interesting show about imagination, the power of imagination, and in some ways it is, but it's also kind of weird and annoying, and I don't think it's really quite good enough to justify its existence.
I had quite a phase when I was a child watching our video that we'd recorded the repeat onto, and I think there are a few cut bits I remember. For instance, the child protagonist Sam reacting quite strongly to the news that the Ink Thief was Miss Tiggle's brother. There are some very interesting, evocative settings, such as Miss Tiggle's library and the Ink Thief's lair and the old toy shop. And I used to enjoy the songs as well.
If anyone says I'm only human, what do we both think of? Richard O'Brien belting that out.
And actually the people in various costumes evoking different kinds of imaginary characters were visually very stimulating as well.
Bumps as a concept have been mentioned on our podcast because they are very interesting and strikingly brought to life on that show.
It's one of those things where it's the premise and the actors and the sets and the costumes that really sell it. And after you've watched it a few times and you look beyond that, you think, hang on, there's nothing there, or certainly there's not enough there.
If anyone's talking about the four elements, I always think, oh yeah, it's earth, water, cheese and air. It's extremely memorable and striking, just unfortunately not really any good in its execution.
I think it would have been a lot better if the ending hadn't been so rushed. Toddy having to be the catalyst because he's a cat bump and help the protagonists really comes to nothing in the end, and there's not really any excuse because there's a whole episode, around episode 3 or 4, where absolutely nothing happens. So pacing is a huge cross in the box against it.
Lethal Weapon was something that was in our house on video because our mum had this absolute obsession with Mel Gibson. He was so gorgeous. She had to collect all his films, which at the time meant Lethal Weapon 1 and 2 on the same tape. Twice the magic, both the movies, the tape proclaimed. Then there were the two sequels to follow, which made her very excited. But the two of us did get a certain amount of enjoyment out of the Lethal Weapon movies. But I really did find when we two had watched them together about 3 times, I wasn't enjoying them at all, finding them funny or at all interesting. And we did get rid of them in the end.
Again, it's the cast that's really the very good thing about Lethal Weapon. They do this thing which is probably not the most original thing it thinks of, contrasting the two main characters. One's a family man with 3 kids, one's a lonely widow, and then he becomes part of the family. So does Leo Getz, who's really the breakout character, intended for Joe Pesci to come and play him in Lethal Weapon 2, but then he was so good he had to become part of the Lethal Weapon family. And the final scene is Roger Murtaugh's first grandchild and Martin Riggs' first child being newborn babies at the hospital, and everybody getting a picture together.
Including the captain, who's never really been too fond of them.
Being asked, "Are you all friends?" and saying, "No, we're family," and that's rather nice.
Only Fools and Horses, arguably the most famous British sitcom ever, or certainly of the 80s and 90s. Wonderful work from David Jason and Nicholas Lyndhurst over the course of 22 years. It really was one of those things when we were young that felt like it was just part of the national fabric. And it does have some extremely good episodes and also some extremely bad and boring episodes, as we discovered when we watched the Christmas episodes on demand one time. And I came to the conclusion then it really only picks up and finds its feet when Cassandra and Raquel turn up, adding a little something into the mix. But goodness me, it's certainly a sitcom god and deserves a mention here.
There's a pattern emerging here. Whatever it is that puts us off these things, it certainly isn't the cost.
I mean, how can anyone watch something like The Jolly Boys Outing to Margate, Our Coach Has Just Blown Up, or Peckham's Spring Water, It's Tap Water, without laughing? I mean, both the examples of the funniest bit I've chosen there are Nicholas Lyndhurst summing something up in a succinct, matter-of-fact but extremely amusing way, and it's part of Nicholas Lyndhurst reacting to things being so funny, as we mentioned in the Goodnight Sweetheart podcast.
I've got an example of that, a sequence I particularly enjoy. Dell trying to convince Rodney to write his script about a killer rhino, but he's pitching it as a whodunit, and Rodney says, "What do you mean whodunit? The rhino done it."
The full series that there is sometime in the early 90s. Normally by then it's specials. But I always remember how you and I were given some very nice ice cream and chocolate sauce with every episode. And we enjoyed eating that and watching Del, Rodney, Uncle Albert, Raquel and Cassandra all doing things together as a sitcom family. So yes, in the past, David Jason and Nicholas Lyndhurst have both had thumbs up from the Olden Days podcast, and they do for Only Fools and Horses, as well as Goodnight Sweetheart and Count Duckula and the BFG. Mrs. Doubtfire is a very good movie. It's genuinely funny, excellent use of Robin Williams and his comedy. It's really genuinely thought-provoking, and as I've mentioned elsewhere, kind of boundary-pushing with what makes a family, and the parents not getting back together at the end and moving on with their lives, and the children's lives adjusting appropriately, but things are still all going to be good, and everyone's going to get along, and things will be different, but not worse.
I love how the message in that is it's okay to get divorced, unlike in any Jurassic Park movie, many of which are much more recent than Mrs. Doubtfire. And I do want to praise Pierce Brosnan in particular for his performance as Miranda's new boyfriend, Stu, who believes he's talking to a sweet old lady and is bemused when she's making these rather barbed comments about him having a flashy car and liposuction and stuff like that.
And doesn't Sally Field do an excellent job of not coming across as a complete nag, stick in the mud businesswoman mum? We're very much able to see things from her point of view, as well as from Daniel Robin Williams' point of view, and understand why their marriage has broken down and why they're going to be better off for themselves and for their 3 children in the future. It's a movie with a lot of heart and a lot of emotional realism, as well as this rather surreal situation of Robin Williams dressing up as an old woman to be a nanny to his children. So that combination of a very real feeling core and this funny situation that makes a funny movie go very well together. Blind Date was something we mentioned on our Mr. Bean podcast, and we did do a slightly longer section about it there, but I cut it because it wasn't really about Mr. Bean. But it does deserve a mention here. You got us into Blind Date on Saturday nights when you were about 8, and I think I was a bit, oh, what is this nonsense at first, Blind Date? Oh, I suppose it's like the Dream Date game on Tiny Toon Adventures. But I did end up enjoying it tremendously, almost entirely because of Cilla Black, really. She presented it so wonderfully, so engagingly, and so kindly, and with such heart. The format invites a certain amount of laughing at the contestants. Oh, these saddos, they can't get a date, they're saying silly things. But Cilla Black is always so warm and nice and fun to them, and any kind of jokes she does aren't jokes at the expense of the contestants, but jokes at the expense of the whole concept of Blind Date, which I think is so important, so that it doesn't become a nasty show, but remains all in good fun.
I really don't remember what it was that made me want to stick with it. If I found it one day on television, I suppose I wanted to see who would get picked on the episode I happened to have come across. And then after that, of course, you have to stick with it because the following week you get the video of them on their date and their interview with Scylla and find out how they got on. And 99 times out of 100, they never want to see each other again. But there were a couple of couples who stayed together at least for some years, weren't there?
And on that 10 Years of Blind Date special that was on while we were watching it, I guess it must have been in 1995, which seems about right, there was this couple coming back on who had a baby with them. And they were saying, thanks to Blind Date, we have this baby. And that was the only long-term relationship producing a baby that happened over the first 10 years of Blind Date. Well, it's better than none, isn't it?
Talk about memorable episodes, there's really only one of Blind Date, I think, which is the one where in one of the this is what happened on their date sections, the woman hadn't gone on the date. She chickened out, so the man was in this hotel doing miniature golf and whatever they used to do by himself. And the other one, the woman turned out to be a journalist.
She's a journalist, ladies and gentlemen,
coming to get the dirt on Blind Date.
And of course we mustn't neglect to mention our Graham with his wonderful voiceovers, and indeed a big factor that caused Cilla Black to quit Blind Date live on ITV, and the fact that she was having to do it live with another one, was that they'd axed Graham in 2002. I mean, where are we without our Graham and his quick recap? Absolutely nowhere, especially when they start introducing stupid sections like Date or Ditch. But there we are, that proper format Blind Date in the early to mid-90s remains a very fond memory for me, and I hope you.
Yes, I had it on my special tape that I made for myself with an episode of The Animals Farthing Wood and that funny crystal maze with the team that win one crystal with Ed.
And surely to goodness we've mentioned that tape on one or both of those podcasts. I'm sure we have, because I remember mentioning that it also had on it Wildlife on One with David Attenborough. Now the last thing I've got written on my Christmas card is Seesaw, which is how I noted down the idea to do a podcast about when we were very young, preschool, lunchtime children's programs, which again I nearly chose instead of Poirot at one point. Now certainly not all the programs I grouped together to try and talk about on that podcast were broadcast on the BBC under the Seesaw segment logo, but many of them were. One thing that put me off actually doing the podcast was the prospect of finding out which ones were on the BBC and which ones weren't. But the glue that bound them all together was the fact that we used to watch them when we were so young, before we'd started school.
I associate these programs with our granny's house, sitting and watching them on her sofa while Jake was at school, and our mum was perhaps doing her part-time job, or she'd gone shopping without me or something.
Which shows you the sort of time of day they would have been on. And there are some that I hardly remember at all that I know I did enjoy, find very stimulating to watch, colourful and interesting, such as Our Backyard, Bric-a-Brac, Gran, Creepy Crawlies, Stop Go, You and Me with Cosmo and Dibs, The Giddy Game Show. That was a big one for me, and one that I think I used to watch and enjoy quite a lot, that they perhaps had stopped repeating quite so much 2 years later when you were about the same age, was Chock-a-Block, which was actually made in 1981, 2 years before I was born, but they used to show it a lot. And I did used to enjoy pressing the buttons and seeing the tape spool and rolling the rocker blocks and the presenters driving the little chocker cart. It was extremely stimulating, and I still have a look at it on YouTube occasionally today. Conversely, once you get to something like Playbus or Playdays, that's really when we were starting to grow out of these things. Of course, Play School was part of it, the latter stages of Play School, which have been on for about 20 years before I was born, and ended about 5 years after I was born. But I do remember Big Ted and Little Ted and Humpty and Jemima and presenters reading stories. And that was kind of replaced by Playbus, Playdays, as it then morphed into.
Playbus is a much better title because there's this bus and it stops at all the different stops to tell you which characters you're going to see.
Yes, I found that very disappointing, actually. It's the Playbus, but where does it go? Well, it's no longer called Playbus, so I'm not really that interested. But going back to what you said about our granny, there are two particular ones I think you remember watching with her, Green Claws and the Flumps.
Yes, I can very much see those on our granny's telly. I remember Green Claws better than I remember the Flumps. In fact, I really can't remember what the Flumps used to do, just the opening sequence. But I remember how Green Claws and Iris would have their theme that the episode was about that day, and plant a seed out of their box of seeds and put it in the tree to grow into a plant that grew, I don't know, bicycle bells or yo-yos or something. And this owl called Alma would make them answer riddles before she'd let them look at it.
Different flavours of soup was one I enjoyed. I thought, oh yes, I'd like a tomato soup plant, and perhaps occasionally I'd press the chicken button. I used to love Alma. Twit-too-too, twit-twit-too. And Iris translates that into any question you like. But it's very easy for the young audience to know that to-wit means truth accepted, and to-woo means falsehood.
Bit bossy, really, wasn't she, making them do that?
I used to find the Green Claws family stories very boring, but I liked the rest of Green Claws. The Flumps was a huge favourite of mine when I was very little.
Our mum said you used to cry when it finished.
But the one big memory I take away from the Flumps is it was the first time I remember specifically realising that I found something really hilariously funny on the television. It was when Father Flump was showing the three children how to do a certain exercise, as in a runny, jumpy thing, as P.C. Goody from the Thin Blue Line would define it. And of course, he fell over while trying to demonstrate this exercise. So the exercise ended up being 1, 2, whoops, and fall over on your backside. And then one of the children was showing this exercise to Mother. Father's just shown us a fantastic exercise we can do. Look, it goes 1, 2, whoops. And he falls over, and I thought that was the funniest thing in the world when I was 3, or perhaps even slightly less. When you mentioned the box of seeds that Green Claws had, that reminded me of the box of different shaped pastry cutters that Pie Man and Pie Wife would always delve into when they were making their musical pie on Pie in the Sky, which was another one I used to absolutely love. and I was always on the edge of my seat wondering if Pie Man was going to fall off his bike that day on his way to meet the pie ship, and sometimes he did.
I was always disappointed when he didn't fall off.
There are some other examples of these shows that I do want to mention, and putting this at the end is a good idea because it's going to be by far the longest section in this podcast, but never mind, it started so we'll finish. One I remember from the kind of seesaw segment, I think it was on BBC in the seesaw segment, though it may not have been, is King Rollo. I like that because it had a magician in it. Bertha, Roy Kinnear doing some wonderful voiceover work.
I used to like seeing all the different things Bertha would make a different one each episode, and I was very surprised when our mum told me, well, in real factories the machines don't work like that. There's a different machine for each thing and they make it every day.
Yes, it takes something from the real world and makes it fun and colourful and relatable to children in a way that's not 100% accurate. Miss McClackerty, I mean, she's a classic children's character, isn't she, with her Scottish accent and her typewriter. Postman Pat, I mean, can anyone who grew up in the 80s claim not to have watched and enjoyed at some point, or at least found some diversion from Postman Pat and his rainy day, or his foggy day, or his magpie hen?
He was so much in the soup that the singing, moving little vehicle that Mr. Bean puts the baby in is Postman Pat's van singing the Postman Pat theme song.
That's right, and that's very much into the 90s, so he's hugely in the soup by then. Let's Pretend, which we both kind of remembered a different aspect of. I remembered the three presenters doing a little story, acting out a little play, pretending, just pretending, as the main part or the second half of each episode. And I think that really inspired the games that we ended up having, pretending to be He-Man and Brave Star and Fantastic Max and things like that. But what's the aspect of Let's Pretend you always remembered? The three presenters sitting round the table and talking, like how to.
Yes, I don't know what the hell they were talking about. Did they used to maybe make things or sing songs?
Yes, I think they do certain things like that as a lead-in to the theme of the little play they're going to perform. But let's mention the caterpillar. You hated it, didn't you?
I was terrified of it. I remember being in my cot, which proves that I was very young, and having a nightmare that this caterpillar, little puppet character for the opening and closing music, was in my cot with me, making its terrifying noise.
Our mother used to enjoy laughing about you, going, "Let's pretend in my cot." But talking about three presenters sitting round a table there, actually, has reminded me of All Sorts, which did always have three presenters doing a kind of sitcom situation, and sometimes they used to sit around the table and do things, sometimes they used to go out into the fake garden. What I find particularly interesting about All Sorts is you don't remember it, as I do, before it had lyrics to the theme tune. And it then morphed into that stupid title, Gigglish All Sorts.
Yeah, I remember them having a different woman from the one they ended up with, and sometimes that woman would play a second character, which was a dog.
Shall I tell you what that is? In the first three series, they have their first woman and Spike the dog, who is played by this other woman. Then in series 4, the other woman takes off the Spike costume and be's the woman. And then in series 5 onwards, they get Jane, or JJ, who sticks with it to the end, with, of course, Bonzo and Jiffy, who are in all episodes.
So I remember aspects of before, but I don't remember it not having lyrics to its theme tune.
Yes, if you remember Spike the dog, then you certainly remember the first three series, so you well remember the time when the lyrics to the theme tune were kite, kite, train, 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 brick, 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 brick. But that's kind of been superseded in your memory by all that when it's an all sorts day, anything can happen crap.
That's right. I remember that Box came along at some point. She wasn't always there. I don't remember how she was introduced or why.
I think she did, in fact, come along with JJ, and they're both in series 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 out of 9.
But the thing I remember most is Box challenging them to entertain themselves without leaving the table And they came up with some good games, including making yourself go "Ugh" by playing Dead Finger. And we tried that after watching it on All Sorts and said, oh, it really does feel weird.
Yes, I find that very memorable as well. And of course, Jiffy attempting to do an April Fool's joke after noon, and then it turning out, aha, you're the fool, because you can only do April Fool's jokes in the morning of April Fool's Day. And nowhere else on any TV show that has April Fool's Day will that be mentioned, and people will be doing April Fool's jokes all day, which is not technically correct. I'm having another memory about Jiffy now of when he acted out the story of King Midas turning things into gold, which shows you the great variety of entertainments you would get on All Sorts, which proves that the title was very apt. But it's reminded me how another fictional character that did the story of King Midas on screen for me was Fingermouse. Despite the fact that I never really enjoyed musical programs, mucking about with instruments, as some people do, and they have every right to, but I don't. I did used to enjoy Fingermouse very much, especially his sort of riverbank adventures with the other puppets, particularly the rat, who's very memorable. And they did do the kind of King Midas takeoff at one point. Fingermouse is King Midas. It's gold, oh lo and behold, I've turned it into gold. But of course he wasn't that pleased about it for very long. And the thing we've really been saving till last is Pigeon Street.
I do remember Pigeon Street. I certainly remember the long-distance Clara sequence. She'd be driving her long-distance lorry and the song would play.
I've always found Long Distance Clara the most memorable and the best aspect of Pigeon Street, really. She challenges gender stereotypes. Long Distance Clara with her juggernaut doing all her deliveries. It's the sort of role you'd expect to see a man in. I remember being struck by that in the 80s. Oh yes, women can have jobs, I already know that, including traditionally male jobs like this long-distance lorry driving. So I do like Long-Distance Clara, and her song is very memorable. She can drive across the Sahara and so on. I used to like the sequence of her driving way down the motorway to the busy port with all the lampposts flashing by. Absolutely brilliant stuff. And there were lots of other characters who had good songs as well, like Mr. McAdoo, Helping Your Pet, Mr. Baskerville and Mr. Jupiter with their telescope and magnifying glass, one looking up, one looking down.
I remember Polly and Molly, the identical twins. I don't know what sorts of things they used to do.
They had a good song about it's easy to see who they are, but only when you see them from the front, because then you see Molly with an M and Polly with a P. And if there wasn't an episode where they swapped jumpers to confuse someone, that is an absolute travesty.
And I do remember the coo of the pigeons, who haven't actually been mentioned by us, though the show is named after them.
So Pigeon Street certainly was entertaining with its interesting characters and the different roles they had in this North London setting. But I always remember on a documentary, I heard the 1980s or something like that, where they showed us that Pigeon Street wasn't averse to a bit of social commentary. The local council had decided that the school didn't need to provide dinners anymore. The children could be made to bring their own, save a bit of money from the council's budget. So the dinner lady, whatever character it was sad because she wasn't going to have a job anymore. That makes it very accessible for children, doesn't it? But it's also a relevant point about the Margaret Thatcher caused recession, and it's a point that's still relevant today, I'm sure. When we were very young, we did used to watch, as you can tell, quite a bit of television. We also did other things. Writing, drawing, reading, playing outside, playing with the Duplo.
You already mentioned playing He-Man and stuff.
But those television programs were a big part of our formative years, of helping us to engage with the world. It's a hugely long time since we really regularly watched any of these shows we've just talked about under the seesaw but possibly not seesaw title. We're looking back almost 40 years there, and the fact that we can think of them and what we liked about them and remember some details about them shows just what an important formative part of our childhood they were. So a thumbs up to all those shows we've mentioned, and you may notice we didn't mention, and doesn't get a thumbs up from the Olden Days podcast, Mr. Ben. The concept would work much better with a child, in my opinion. But there we are. Hopefully you've got some enjoyment out of our reminiscences there. And hopefully you will join us again for our next Olden Days special on Christmas Eve this year. As was mentioned before, it is going to be a Christmas special where we talk about Santa Claus the movie.
It's a Wonderful Life.
And some Christmas specials of TV shows that we've enjoyed more than we enjoyed the Only Fools and Horses ones. Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.